Here is Quideo number 4, the basic question. So the basic question says, the Census Bureau reports that households spend an average of 31% of their total spending on housing. A home builders association in Cleveland believes that this average is lower in their area. So they interview a sample of 40 households in Cleveland, and they want to test the hypotheses that the null hypothesis is the population mean is equal to 31%, and then that the alternative would be that they're less than 31%. And it gives that the population standard deviation is 9.6%. So the first question says, what is the sampling distribution of the mean percent X bar that the sample spends on housing if the null hypothesis is true? And then to sketch the density curve of the sampling distribution. So to answer the first part of the question, it says, what is the sampling distribution? So the sampling distribution will be in the format of n, mu, and then the standard deviation of the sample. And so they give you that the population mean is 31%, and then the standard deviation of the population is of the sample is the population standard deviation divided by the square root of your sample size. So it'd be 9.6% divided by the square root of 40, and you get 1.5179% is your sample standard deviation. And so your sampling distribution is n 31% and 1.5179%. And then the second part says to sketch the density curve. So to sketch a density curve, you have to find the standard deviations away from the population mean. That's in the middle. So one standard deviation away is here, and then 2, and then 3. So you just calculate that doing the population mean, and then plus or minus the standard deviation, depending on how far out you want to go. And the next part of the question says, to suppose that the study finds that X bar is equal to 30.2%, and then it also says 27.6%. So it says to mark it on the density curve. So the 30.2% is going to be right about here, and the 27.6 will be right about here. And then it says referring to the sketch, explain in simple language why one result is good evidence that the average Cleveland spending on housing is less than 31%, and then whereas the other one is not. So looking at this, so assuming the null hypothesis is true and that the average Cleveland spending on housing is less than 31%, 27.6% is unlikely since it lies between the second and third standard deviations away from the population mean. And 30.2% is more reasonable since it falls within that first standard deviation. And so based on the placement of each of the sample means on the normal curve, the mean of the 30.2% provides better evidence that the average spending on housing in Cleveland is less than 31%. And the last part of the basic question says to shade the area under the curve that gives the p-value for the result X bar is equal to 30.2%. So since we are looking for less than the null hypothesis, so the p-value is the probability that the sample mean will be 30.2%. And so the probability is basically just the z-score, or the area under the density curve. So we have to shade less than 30.2%. So it's going to be all of this right here. So this is the the area under the curve, or the probability that the sample mean will be 30.2%. Next is the advanced question, and the advanced question says, Pew Research in November 2011 polled a random sample of 799 U.S. teens about internet use. 49% of those teens reported that they had misrepresented their age online to gain access to websites and online services. And the first question asks, find the margin of error for this poll if we want 95% confidence in our estimate of the percent of American teens who have misrepresented their age online. So to find the margin of error, I'm looking at a confidence interval. It's this part right here. And so just writing that as E, margin of error. So your Z star is going to be 1.96 because you want 95% confidence. And looking at table C, this is the number that matches up. Your p-value is going to be 0.49 since we're looking at 49% of teens that reported that they misrepresented their age. The Q is just a complement, so it'd be 0.51, and then N is the sample size, so we have a sample of 799 U.S. teens. And so the margin of error when you plug everything in is 0.0347. And so that answers the first question, and the second question says to explain what the margin of error means in context. So looking at the actual confidence interval, so our p-hat value is going to be the same, is the 49% of teens. And then using the margin of error we found in the last question, this is our interval. And looking at that as a percent, it's 45.53% to 52.47%. And so we can be 95% confident that the true proportion or the percent of American teens that admitted that they had misrepresented their age online lies between 0.4553 and 5247, or 45.53% and 52.47%. And then the last part of the advanced question says, if we only need to be 90% confident, will the margin of error be larger or smaller, and explain. So if you look at a 90% confidence interval, your Z-star value is 1.645. And so you get that by looking in table C, and since this value is lower than the Z-star value in a 95% confidence interval, since that's 1.96, and all the other numbers are going to be staying the same, the margin of error will be smaller due to the narrower interval being narrower. And the last question is the AP question. And the AP question, it says, each person in a random sample of 1,026 adults in the United States was asked the following question. Based on what you know about the Social Security system today, what would you like Congress and the President to do during this next year? And then it gives the response choices and the percentages for this sample and what answer choice they chose. So the first question says, find a 95% confidence interval for the proportion of all U.S. adults who would respond, make some major changes to the question. And then give an interpretation of the confidence interval and an interpretation of the confidence level. So to find a 95% confidence interval, you first have to look at the conditions to see if you can go further. So it said that it was a random sample of 1,026 adults. So its simple random sample was stated. So you need a large sample size. And so this holds true because approximately, 10 times our sample size is about 10,000 adults, which is definitely less than all U.S. adults. And then to make sure that our sample is large enough, you're going to do the sample size times your p-value, which would be the 39% in this case. So multiplying those together, it is greater than 10, and then doing n times the complement is also greater than 10. So the conditions are satisfied for this, so we can continue. And so looking at the confidence interval, our p-hat value is going to be that 39% of adults that said that they would like major changes. The z-star value for a 95% confidence interval is 1.96. The p-value is going to be the same as the p-hat for this one. And then the complement is 1 minus your p-value, so it's 0.61. And then our n value is the 1,026 U.S. adults. And so when you plug everything in, you get this as your confidence interval. Or you get this, and then this would be your confidence interval. It would be 0.3602 to 0.4198. And then if you want to look at that as percents, it's 36.02% to 41.98%. So that would be our confidence interval. And the second part of this question says to give an interpretation of the confidence interval and an interpretation of the confidence level. So the interpretation of the confidence interval is from this sample of 1,026 U.S. adults, we are 95% confident that the proportion of all U.S. adults who would respond make some changes is between 0.3602 and 0.4198, or 36.02% and 41.98%. And then the interpretation of the confidence level is that over time, 95% of all the intervals using this method will contain the true population proportion, and a 95% confidence means that you have a 5% error rate. And then looking at the second part of this question, it says an advocate for leaving the system as it is now commented, based on this poll, only 39% of adults in the sample responded that they would want some major changes made to the system, while 41% responded that they want only minor changes or no changes at all. Therefore, we should not change the system. And explain why this statement, while technically correct, is misleading. So this statement is misleading because in addition to the 39%, who wanted major changes, 19% wanted to completely overhaul the system. So by combining these two groups, you get 58% of the U.S. adults, which is definitely more than half, want to change the system in some way majorly. So they had a stronger opinion on that than the minor and no changes, which would be misleading for this person's statement. And that's the end of Quideo number 4.